A desperate knock on a storm-battered door. A bleeding, trembling man begging for a single night of shelter from a lonely, exiled healer. She thought she was saving a dying peasant from the brutal frost. She had no idea she had just invited the most ruthless Alpha King into her home. The winter of 1347 did not arrive with a gentle frost. It descended upon the borderlands of Aylesbury like a falling axe. For Genevieve Miller, an outcast apothecary living on the ragged edge of the kingdom's darkest forest, the biting cold was the least of her worries. 3 years ago, the local magistrate Lord Alaric Hastings had burned her mentor at the stake for practicing unsanctioned medicine. Genevieve had barely escaped the pyre, fleeing to this dilapidated stone cabin, where she survived on the meagre coppers villagers secretly paid her for fever reducers and birthing tonics. It was the night of the winter solstice, when the blizzard struck, burying the world in blinding, howling white. Genevieve was sitting by her dying hearth, grinding dried willow bark into a fine powder, when she heard it. Thump. It was a heavy, wet sound against her thick oak door. She froze, her mortar and pestle suspended in the air. The wind screamed through the cracks in the stone walls, but beneath the gale there was a secondary noise, a ragged, rattling intake of breath. Cautiously, Genevieve reached for the iron fire poker resting by the ashes. She crept toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. In these woods, the things that knocked after midnight were rarely human. Highwaymen deserters from the king's army, or worse, the feral wolves that had been growing unnervingly bold in recent months. She unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door inward just a fraction. The wind immediately ripped it from her grasp, slamming it against the inner wall with a deafening crack. A flurry of snow swept into her modest home, and with it, a massive, unmoving shadow collapsed face first onto her floorboards. Genevieve let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward. It was a man. He was impossibly large, his broad shoulders filling the entryway, clad in a shredded, blood-soaked tunic of dark wool. Snow clung to his thick, raven-black hair, and his hands, massive and calloused, were curled into agonizing fists. Slowly the man forced himself to lift his head. His face was obscured by grime, frozen blood, and sweat, but his eyes caught the firelight. They were a striking, piercing amber. "I'm sick." He rasped his voice, a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath her boots. He coughed a wet, terrible sound, and a fresh string of dark blood spilled from his lips onto the wood. "I can't walk. Please. Can I stay?" One night, before she could answer, his eyes rolled back, and his massive frame went entirely limp. Genevieve stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment. The law of Aylesbury was clear. Harboring a fugitive was punishable by hanging, but looking at the brutalized state of the man, the healer's oath burned brighter than her fear. She dropped the iron poker, grabbed him under the arms, and strained with all her meager strength to drag him away from the howling storm. It was like pulling a fallen oak tree, but she managed to heave him onto the straw-stuffed mattress in the corner of the room. She shoved the heavy door shut, sealing the biting wind outside. It was only when she stripped away his ruined tunic to assess the damage that the true horror of his condition revealed itself. His torso was a canvas of violence. 3 massive parallel lacerations tore across his chest as if he had been struck by a bear. But the edges of the wounds were strange. They were blackened, blistering, and gave off a faint, sickening scent of charred metal. Silver burns, Genevieve realized her breath catching in her throat. She had read of such things in her mentor's forbidden texts. Silver poisoning did not happen to ordinary men. It was the only weapon known to wound the lycanthropes, the shape-shifting warlords of the north who had been hunted to near extinction by the crown. Panic seized her. Her hands trembled as she reached for a rag, soaking it in boiling water. "If this man is a lycan, I am dead," she thought frantically. "If he wakes and loses control, he will tear me limb from limb." Yet as she washed the grime from his face, the terrifying monster she imagined began to fade. Beneath the blood was a remarkably handsome, rugged face with a strong aristocratic jawline and an expression of profound exhaustion. He looked vulnerable. He looked human. Genevieve worked through the night, a silent ghost dancing between her apothecary table and his bedside. She packed the blistering silver burns with a poultice of crushed comfrey yarrow and a dangerous pinch of wolfsbane to draw out the mystical toxins. She sewed his torn flesh with a sterilized needle and thick black thread, marveling at how his muscles seemed to twitch and knit together beneath her very fingertips. His healing rate was unnatural, terrifyingly fast, confirming her darkest suspicions. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving the forest submerged in a haunting, crystalline silence. Genevieve sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, a hunting knife gripped loosely in her lap, watching the stranger breathe. His amber eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh morning light streaming through the frosted window pane. He looked down at his bandaged chest, then slowly turned his head to look at her. There was no feral madness in his gaze, only a deep, calculating intelligence. "You sewed me up," he murmured, his voice hoarse, but steady. "You were dying," Genevieve replied, her grip tightening on the knife handle. "Who did this to you, the king's huntsman?" A dark shadow crossed his face, but he offered a weak, charming smile. "Bandits, my lady. Nasty ones with a penchant for cruel weapons. My name is Arthur. I am nothing but a humble blacksmith from the northern shires. I lost my way in the snow." Genevieve stared at him. It was a lie, a blatant, beautifully delivered lie. Blacksmiths did not have silver burns, and they certainly did not heal from mortal wounds in 6 hours. But as he looked at her with those warm, exhausted eyes, Genevieve decided to play along. If he wanted to be Arthur the blacksmith, she would let him. For now. "I am Genevieve," she said quietly, sliding the knife back into its sheath. "You may stay until the storm clears, Arthur, but then you must leave. Trouble follows men who bleed silver, and I have had enough trouble for one lifetime. I owe you my life, Genevieve," he whispered, his eyes heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "I will not bring you harm. That is a vow." Arthur stayed for 3 days. The blizzard had left the roads completely impassable, trapping them together in the tiny claustrophobic stone cabin. What began as a terrifying hostage situation of Genevieve's own mind slowly melted into an unexpected domestic rhythm. Despite his massive injuries, Arthur refused to remain bedridden. By the second morning, he was up moving with a predatory grace that betrayed his blacksmith persona. He chopped a mountain of firewood in the freezing cold, his bare chest radiating an intense, unnatural heat that melted the snowflakes before they could touch his skin. He repaired her sagging roof with effortless strength, and in the evenings he sat by the fire whittling a piece of pine, while Genevieve crushed her herbs. There was a magnetic pulling tension between them. Every time Genevieve leaned over him to change his bandages, she could feel the hard, coiled power of his muscles. She could hear his heart beating a slow, thunderous drum against her ribs. And Arthur was equally captivated. His amber eyes tracked her every movement, watching her with a fierce, unwavering intensity that made her skin flush. On the third night, as a pot of rabbit stew bubbled over the flames, the silence between them broke. "Why are you out here alone?" Genevieve Arthur asked, setting his whittling knife down. The flickering firelight danced across the deep scars on his face. "A woman of your skill should be the head healer in a noble's court, not hiding in the dirt." Genevieve's hands paused over her mortar. A bitter smile touched her lips. "The nobles in this kingdom do not reward skill, Arthur. They fear it. Lord Alaric Hastings rules Aylesbury. When my mentor cured a plague, that Alaric's own physician could not, Alaric called it witchcraft. He burned her alive in the town square. I ran before he could throw me on the ashes." The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Genevieve shivered, looking up. Arthur's amber eyes had darkened to the colour of molten gold. His jaw was clenched so tightly she thought his teeth might shatter, and a low guttural vibration, almost like a growl, emanated from his chest. The sheer suffocating aura of dominance radiating from him forced Genevieve to take a step back. He burned a healer. Arthur's voice was a dangerous, lethal whisper. Lord Alaric Hastings will find that fire is a fickle friend, Genevieve. It consumes the man who lights the match just as easily. Before she could ask what he meant, the sudden, violent sound of a hunting horn shattered the quiet night. Genevieve's blood ran cold. The horn sounded again, closer this time. It was the unmistakable, terrifying wail of the king's huntsman. "They are here!" Genevieve choked out, rushing to the window. Through the frosted glass, she saw the glow of a dozen torches weaving through the tree line, accompanied by the heavy thud of armoured war horses. "They're checking the border cabins." Arthur stood up, his massive frame instantly shifting into a combative stance. The gentle blacksmith was gone. In his place stood a hardened, lethal warrior. "Are there hiding places in this hovel under the floorboards?" Genevieve said frantically, rushing to the rug near the bed and throwing it aside. She pried up a loose wooden plank, revealing a shallow, cramped root cellar. "Get in. Do not make a sound, Arthur. If they are looking for you, they will kill us both." Arthur looked at the tiny, dirty hole, then at Genevieve. He reached out his massive hand, cupping her cheek with surprising gentleness. His thumb brushed over her bottom lip, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "I will not let them harm you, little bird," he swore softly. He slipped into the dark space, and Genevieve quickly replaced the plank and kicked the rug over it. Seconds later, the front door was kicked open with such force that it ripped off its iron hinges. 3 heavily armoured soldiers poured into the tiny room, swords drawn. Behind them stepped Commander Gideon Cross, the king's most feared Lycan hunter. He was a tall, skeletal man, adorned in chainmail and a cloak made from the pelts of slaughtered wolves. He carried a heavy, silver-plated broadsword, and his eyes swept the room with sadistic glee. "Well, well," Gideon sneered, stepping over the broken door. "If it isn't Genevieve Miller, the little witch who got away." Genevieve forced her hands to stop shaking, lifting her chin. "I am no witch, Commander. I am simply a woman trying to survive the winter. What do you want?" Gideon stepped closer, his boots tracking muddy snow across the floorboards, directly over the rug where Arthur hid. Genevieve's heart stopped. "We are not hunting witches tonight, girl," Gideon said, pacing the room. He picked up one of Genevieve's dried herbs, sniffing it before crushing it in his gauntlet. "We are hunting a monster. The Beast of the North was ambushed by our forces 3 days ago near the River Trent. We wounded him with silver, but the beast crawled away to bleed out in the snow." Gideon suddenly stopped, his eyes locking onto the blood-stained rag Genevieve had tossed into the corner basin earlier that day. He walked over, picked it up and brought it to his nose. A wicked, triumphant smile split his face. "Fresh blood. And it reeks of lichen." Gideon dropped the rag and turned to Genevieve, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his silver sword. "Where is he, girl? Where are you hiding?" "King Cailan." Genevieve's breath hitched. King Cailan. The legends flooded her mind. Cailan of the Ironfang Pack was not just a Lycan. He was the Alpha King. He was a mythological warlord who had united the savage northern tribes. They said he stood 7 feet tall, that he could rip a man in half with his bare hands, and that he had personally massacred 300 royal soldiers in the siege of Blackwater. Arthur. Arthur was Cailan, the man who had been whittling wood by her fire, the man whose chest she had stitched, was the most dangerous predator on the continent. "I don't know what you're talking about," Genevieve lied smoothly, though terror clawed at her throat. "A poacher came by 2 nights ago. He was bleeding from a bear trap." I patched him up and he left. I haven't seen any king." Gideon stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then, without warning, he struck her. The back of his armored gauntlet collided with Genevieve's cheek. The sheer force sent her flying across the room, crashing hard into the wooden apothecary table. Glass vials shattered, raining down on her as she collapsed to the floor. Blood instantly poured from a deep gash above her eye, blinding her. "You lie witch." Gideon spat, drawing his silver sword. The terrible metallic shing rang out through the cabin. "You are harboring the Alpha King. If you do not tell me where he is, I will cut you to ribbons and burn this shack to the ground with you inside." Genevieve gasped for air, clutching her bleeding head. Through her blurred vision, she saw Gideon raise his sword to strike her again. But the blow never fell. A deafening, monstrous roar shook the very foundation of the cabin. The heavy wooden floorboards in the center of the room exploded upward in a shower of splinters and nails. From the dark pit beneath the floor rose a nightmare of muscle shadow and lethal fury. Arthur No Kalin stood at his full height, completely eclipsing the firelight. The air in the room grew instantly suffocating, heavy with the terrifying primal dominance of an enraged alpha. His bones were cracking, his muscles expanding, tearing the shirt from his back. His amber eyes were no longer human. They were glowing feral and utterly devoid of mercy. He looked at Genevieve's bleeding face, and a sound ripped from his throat, a sound so purely demonic and possessive that it made the royal soldiers instantly drop to their knees in absolute terror. Kalin turned his golden, murderous gaze upon Commander Gideon. "You touched what is mine," the Alpha King growled, his voice vibrating with earth-shattering power. "And for that huntsman, you will not die quickly." The cabin dissolved into absolute chaos. Commander Gideon Cross, a man who had slaughtered dozens of Lycans, stepped backward, his face draining of all color. He raised his silver broadsword, his hands shaking so violently the metal rattled. The two remaining soldiers didn't even attempt to fight. They bolted for the broken doorway, abandoning their commander to the nightmare that had just crawled from the earth. They didn't make it. Kalin moved with a speed that defied physics. He was a blur of lethal predatory violence. In a fraction of a second, he intercepted the fleeing guards. With a sickening crunch, he grabbed the first soldier by the iron breastplate and hurled him through the thick stone wall of the cabin as if he weighed no more than a child's rag doll. The second guard screamed, drawing a dagger, but Kalin simply backhanded him. The force snapped the man's neck instantly, sending him collapsing into the snow outside. Kalin turned his burning amber eyes back to Gideon. "Stay back." Gideon shrieked, swinging the massive silver sword in a wide, desperate arc, aimed directly at Kalin's neck. Genevieve screamed from the floor, "Kalin the Silver!" But the Alpha King didn't dodge. He reached out and caught the razor-sharp silver blade with his bare hand. The sound of sizzling flesh filled the room, accompanied by the acrid stench of burning skin. But Kalin's expression didn't change. He didn't even flinch. His golden eyes remained locked on Gideon, utterly devoid of mercy. With a terrifying surge of raw strength, Kalin twisted his wrist. The enchanted silver broadsword, forged by the royal armourers of Somerset, shattered into 3 jagged pieces, ringing uselessly against the floorboards. Gideon fell to his knees, his arrogance completely evaporating into pathetic weeping terror. "Please," the commander begged, raising his hands. "I am an officer of the crown. You cannot— You brought a sword into my mate's home." Kalin growled his voice, dropping to a demonic, resonant pitch that rattled the glass in the window panes. "You struck my queen. The crown cannot save you from me." Before Gideon could utter another plea, Kalin's hand shot forward, wrapping around the commander's throat. He lifted the armored man off the ground, with one arm, his claws extending from his fingertips and piercing the chainmail as if it were parchment. A swift, brutal twist, and Commander Gideon Cross went completely limp. Cailan tossed the body aside with disgust. The cabin fell into a dead, ringing silence, save for the howling wind outside and the crackle of the dying hearth. Genevieve pressed her back against the splintered apothecary table, her chest heaving. Blood was still dripping from her brow, stinging her eye. She watched as Cailan stood amidst the wreckage of her home. His chest was heaving, his muscles coiled tight, the savage beast still raging beneath his skin. He was terrifying. He was the monster the stories had warned her about. Slowly, Cailan turned to face her. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself, unsure if the feral bloodlust had entirely consumed him. But the brutal, bone-crushing strike never came. Instead, she felt a sudden radiating warmth. She opened her eyes to find the towering, blood-soaked Alpha King kneeling on the floor before her. The monstrous aura had vanished. He reached out with trembling, hesitant hands, the very hands that had just ripped armored men apart, and gently, so incredibly gently, cupped her face. His thumb carefully wiped the blood from her bruised cheek. "I am so sorry, Genevieve," he whispered, the gravelly, gentle voice of Arthur the blacksmith returning. The molten gold in his eyes softened back to a warm, sorrowful amber. "I swore I would not bring you harm. I have failed you. You are the king of the North." Genevieve stammered, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. "You are Cailan." "I am," he confessed, refusing to look away from her. "I was ambushed at the River Trent by 50 of the king's men. I dragged myself through the blizzard for 3 days, expecting to die in the snow. And then I smelled you. I smelled cedar-crushed willow and something entirely beautiful. My wolf dragged me to your door. You are my mate, Genevieve. The gods wove our souls together before we drew our first breath." Genevieve stared at him. A mate. The Lycan bond of absolute devotion. It explained the magnetic pull she had felt since he crashed through her door, the way his mere presence made her blood sing. "They will come back," she whispered, looking at the dead royal commander. "When Gideon does not return to Aylesbury, Lord Alaric will send the entire garrison. They will burn the forest down to find you." A dark, dangerous smile touched the corner of Cailan's mouth. He stood effortlessly, lifting Genevieve into his massive arms, cradling her against his chest. "Let them try," Cailan rumbled, "but we will not be here. I am taking you to my home, little bird, and when the snow thaws, Lord Alaric Hastings is going to learn exactly why they call me the Beast of the North." 2 months later, the punishing winter finally broke, giving way to the muddy, turbulent spring of 1348. But for the town of Aylesbury, the thaw did not bring relief. It brought a reckoning. Genevieve stood on a high, grassy ridge overlooking the stone walls of Aylesbury. She was no longer the ragged, terrified apothecary hiding in a crumbling cabin. She wore a heavy cloak of immaculate white dire-wolf fur over a gown of deep crimson velvet. Her dark hair was braided with bands of northern gold, and her posture radiated a quiet, undeniable authority. She was the Alpha Queen of the Iron Fang Pack, completely adored and protected by the fiercest warriors on the continent. Below her, the town was burning. It was not a chaotic, mindless slaughter. Cailan's Lycan army was disciplined, striking with surgical precision. They bypassed the commoners' thatched homes and the merchant quarters, directing their unstoppable fury solely at the military garrison and the sprawling, opulent manor of Lord Alaric Hastings. The king's soldiers, so used to hunting weak, scattered Lycans in the woods, broke instantly against the coordinated armored might of Cailan's forces. Cailan stood beside her on the ridge, his massive hand resting protectively on the small of her back. He wore forged black steel armor, the silver scars on his chest peeking through the leather straps, a permanent reminder of the night they met. "It is secure," a deep voice announced. A massive Lycan general named rumbled up the ridge, bowing deeply to Genevieve before addressing his king. "The garrison has surrendered. The townspeople are untouched as the Queen commanded. We have extracted the magistrate." "Bring him," Cailan commanded. Moments later, Lord Alaric Hastings was dragged up the muddy hill by two towering Lycan guards. The magistrate who had spent his life terrorizing the weak and burning innocent healers was unrecognizable. His fine silk clothes were torn, his face pale and slick with the sweat of absolute terror. They threw him to the ground, forcing him to his knees before Genevieve. Alaric looked up his eyes, darting frantically between the monstrous Alpha King and the woman draped in royal furs. It took him a long moment to recognize the scar above her eye, the faint silver line where Gideon had struck her. "You—" Alaric gasped, his voice cracking. "The apothecary's apprentice. The witch." Cailan lunged forward, a savage snarl ripping from his throat, ready to tear the man's head from his shoulders for the insult. But Genevieve raised a single graceful hand. Cailan stopped, instantly yielding to his mate's command, though his eyes burned with lethal promise. Genevieve stepped forward, her velvet dress dragging softly across the damp grass. She looked down at the man who had burned her mentor alive, the man who had forced her to live in fear and starvation. She felt no fear anymore. She felt only cold, absolute clarity. "I am no witch, Lord Alaric," Genevieve said, her voice carrying a regal, chilling calm. "And I am no longer a frightened girl hiding in the woods. I am Genevieve, Queen of the North. You burned innocent women in the name of your false righteousness. You poisoned this land. Mercy." Alaric openly sobbed, pressing his forehead into the mud at her feet. "Please, Your Grace. I was only following the laws of the Crown." "The Crown has no authority here anymore," Cailan rumbled, stepping up beside his mate, his massive presence casting a long, dark shadow over the weeping magistrate. "My mate promised you that fire is a fickle friend. Did you truly believe your cruelty would go unanswered?" Genevieve looked at Cailan, nodding once. She turned away, walking back toward the northern tree line where her royal guard waited. Behind her, she heard the sudden, terrifying sound of shifting bone, followed by the monstrous, deafening roar of the Alpha King. Alaric's scream was cut brutally short, silenced forever beneath the jaw of the beast. As Genevieve mounted her massive armored black steed, Cailan returned to her side, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His human form was restored, his amber eyes looking up at her with a devotion so fierce it stole her breath. "Is it done?" she asked softly. "It is done, my queen," Cailan replied, taking her hand and pressing a reverent kiss to her knuckles. "Aylesbury is free. The North is avenged, and you never have to hide in the dark again." Genevieve looked out over the horizon. The smoke from Alaric's ruined manor was already clearing, giving way to a bright, piercing sunrise. She smiled, squeezing her mate's massive hand. She had opened her door to save a dying blacksmith, and in return, the universe had given her a king. Did you enjoy this thrilling tale of betrayal, revenge, and destined mates? If Genevieve and Cailan's fierce romance captivated your heart, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow fantasy and romance lovers. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next epic storytelling adventure. Leave a comment below. What would you do if a disguised alpha knocked on your door?